2213 and HB 2214. Take a look at those, go over them. We'll have the hearing on that Thursday. Now, I was looking at the, that's Thursday the 6th. And then we were looking at doing a final action on the 11th of February. But we're probably going to delay that because February 11th is the recognition, military recognition day. And so we do have a final schedule, and we'll be getting those to you. And we'll take a look at that because I'm not sure what time or how much time we're going to have on that morning. There's a lot of events, a lot of good events, and I want you all to be able to participate in those. And so we good to go? So that's our plan for the near future here. And we only have 3 other bills for the rest of the session that we'll be looking at. Now, none of the HB numbers have come out yet, so stay tuned on that. Today, I'm really honored to be able to introduce the speaker that we have today, Director Mativi with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation is speaking with us today. And I'm excited about that, and I'll tell this little story how we first met. It's ever since I came back to Kansas City, this has been the way it's usually gone with me. We were at a pro-life, I think, meeting in Bonner at the event center. And Director Mativi came up, and I was sitting at a table, and he sat down real quick right next to me and said, "Can you give me a call next week?" And I went, "Sure, but I don't know who you are." He said, "You're the Senator, Thompson, aren't you? Aren't you the weatherman?" So that was we had fun with that, and we've been friends since, and it's been an honor. And we found out that we were in Iraq at the same time, and that's what he's going to speak to today is what he was doing. But anyway, at this time, let me introduce Director Mativi. Sir, thanks again so much for being with us today.
How about that? Thanks, Representative Thompson. So when Mike called, he said, "Would you be willing to just come over and talk to the committee a little bit about your experiences in Iraq?" And of course, I'm happy to do that. It was a fascinating, informative experience for me as a person. I'm not sure how relevant it is to the work that you're doing, and I kind of hate to take up your time with it in such a busy session, but I'm happy to do it if you like. So I started my legal career in the DA's office in Topeka in 1993 prosecuting speeding tickets. And I worked my way up the ladder there from speeding tickets to drug crimes to property crimes to person crimes. And then I went to work for the Attorney General's office and then went to work for the U.S. Attorney's office in 1998. And I will never forget the events of 9/11 and where I was on that morning. And then but I was a dope and violent crime prosecutor in the federal court in Kansas, and I didn't really have anything to do with national security. But I think we all remember what the country was like at the time, and all of us wanting to do something for our country. And in 2007, I worked for the Department of Justice. DOJ asked for volunteers with complex case experience to come to Iraq and help the Iraqis try some of the war crimes cases. And by that time, my caseload was mostly large, complex drug organization cases. And so I certainly had that complex case experience. But I'd never been in the military. I grew up an Air Force brat, but I had never served. But when they made that request, I felt like this is my chance to do something. Our kids were young, 10, 7, and 4. And my wife worked full-time in the DA's office here in Topeka at the time. And so when I agreed to go do this, and people commended me for my willingness to go to Iraq during a war, um, the the burden really was borne by her, because for the 6 months that I was over there, she was at home by herself with a full-time job, taking care of 3 little kids. Now, I'll tell you kind of a funny story about something that happened when I was over there. Don't let me forget as I start rambling. Um, but my job was to go over there and work in what was called the Regime Crimes Liaison Office. And that was a joint military and civilian shop. The regime crime liaison, the person who ran the office, was a DOJ employee like me. He was a very experienced, very senior assistant U.S. attorney from Florida. But his chief of staff, that was a Navy 06 billet. So the first half of my tour there, it was a former Navy submariner who was in that billet, and then he transitioned out, and we had a naval aviator in that billet. But the staff was very much a mix of military and civilians, and we had we had 8 prosecutors or 8 attorneys in the office. The guy in the picture is Todd Hinckley. Like me, Todd was an assistant U.S. attorney. He worked in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And we had 4 assistant U.S. attorneys and 4 JAGs, 1 from each branch. And together, we advised all of the prosecutors working on all of the war crimes cases in Iraq, and then all of the judges. And then we had a separate shop that advised the defense counsel. So Americans were there. We didn't actually go into court, but our job was to help the Iraqis. You know, Iraq has one of the oldest legal systems in the world, but it's very different from ours. One of the main differences that struck me right away is when you're in court in America, one of the things that you get used to is everything you say is recorded. Everything that happens in a courtroom is on the record, and usually there's a court reporter there, you know, taking. I can't remember the name of the machine that they use, but they're there actively transcribing everything that you say. And as technology has advanced, that's developed to where it's real time. And so when you ask for a question to be read back, you can stop, and the court reporter will stop and look back and actually read back the question. What happens in Iraq is that court is also on the record, but the record there is this big notebook that's about 2.5 feet by 3 feet. And the court reporter walks into court at the beginning of the session and sets that down on the desk and opens it up and takes out a pen and starts writing. But the only thing that gets written down is what the judge tells the court reporter to write down. So for example, in America, if an attorney asks a question, that attorney gets taken down real time. In Iraq, the attorney asks the question of the judge, and then the judge will decide whether that question gets asked to the witness or not, and the judge will ask the question. And if the judge says, I'm not asking that, that's irrelevant, that's prejudicial, whatever, not only does the judge not ask the question of the witness, but it doesn't even go into the record of the proceeding. So that's one of the things that's very different. Another is that witnesses can testify shielded from public view and shielded from view of the defendants. So let me circle back to that. My job when I got there was to help the 4 Iraqi prosecutors who had been assigned to prosecute what was called the 1991 Intifada, or uprising. And I don't expect anybody in the room to know what that was about, but in 1991, in the Basra province of Iraq, which was a far southeastern province down on the Gulf, there was an uprising against Saddam and his regime. And in traditional Saddam fashion, he put down that uprising in the most violent way that you can imagine. He brought his troops in, they leveled villages, they killed every military-aged male in the village, they raped women, and they would then forcibly relocate the families that were left to different parts of the country. Uh, So when I got there, that case was just getting ready for trial. And there were 4 Iraqis who were assigned to prosecute it. And uh, my job was to help them prep that case, help them get it ready, and then try it. And one of the things about their legal system that's very different from ours is they are used to just putting on all of their witnesses, and then later on, they introduce all of their evidence. And so one of the things that we all were doing, all of us, with all of our teams, we're talking to the prosecutors about how you can combine those two and make it a much more effective presentation, right? If you have a witness explain what the exhibit is to the judge, that exhibit has a lot more impact on the judge than if you just bring it in. And a good example is we had an iron as an exhibit. And the iron was, one of the things that you have to understand about Iraq is that there are a lot of parts of that country that are straight out of the Bronze Age, right? And so an iron in Iraq isn't like an iron that we're used to. It's not something that you plug in. It's something that you heat over the fire. It's a hard piece of metal with a very crude handle on it. And one of the witnesses that we had was a sheep rancher. And he had been part of the group that rose up against Saddam. And when those troops came in, well, let me give you a little more context to the story. But by the time I got there in March of 2007, Saddam was dead. Saddam had been captured, he'd been tried in 3 different trials, he'd been convicted, and he was executed on New Year's Eve 3 months before I got there. So although Saddam was a named defendant in our case, he wasn't in the dock. And when I say in the dock, that's another interesting feature of their legal system. Defendants don't sit at a table with counsel. Judge sits in a courtroom just like you would imagine. Prosecutors sit over here, defense attorneys sit over here, and then all of the defendants sit in what they call a dock. And we had 12 defendants in our case, and they all sat in basically a cage in the middle of the courtroom. Our lead defendant was a guy named Ali Hassan al-Majid. They called him Chemical Ali. He was Saddam's cousin. And he was very much one of Saddam's henchmen. And he acted in Saddam's place in a lot of different matters that were going on. And he was one of the people who led the troops that quelled the uprising in the Basra province. And the witness that we had who testified gave the most amazing testimony. To this day, I can't believe that he survived. But he testified about Chemical Ali heating an iron up over a hot fire as this gentleman was tied and restrained in a chair. And he was tortured by having that iron put up against the side of his head. And a lot of the witnesses who testified, we had a separate entrance for them to come into the courtroom. And they would come in the side and they would testify behind a curtain. So Judge Muhammad could see them, but none of the defendants in the dock could see them, and even the attorneys in the courtroom couldn't see them behind the curtain. And as this guy was telling his story, he insisted to Judge Muhammad that somebody should pull the curtain back. Because as he testified about what Chemical Ali did to him, he wanted to look him in the eye. And he pointed him out to Judge Muhammad, and as we looked at the burn on the side of his head, pointed at Chemical Ali and he said, "That's the man who did this to me." And he had the ability, like all of the witnesses, to stay behind that curtain so these guys couldn't see him. And it was, I think, one of the most courageous things I ever witnessed when he insisted that that curtain be moved aside so that he could look Chemical Ali in the eye and point at him as he identified him as the guy that did that to his face. It was really compelling. But one of the overarching themes about us being there is that even though Saddam was dead, that entire country was still very afraid of his infrastructure, of his people, and they were very afraid that Saddam's people were going to come back into power. And so in the United States, it's very unusual for us to have court proceedings that are televised. You might see them in a high-profile trial, especially in state court. You never see them in federal court. The court we were in there was called the Iraqi High Tribunal. It was a war crimes court that was set up in Iraq for the specific purpose of trying Saddam and his regime for war crimes. You know, there are other war crimes courts that exist around the world. There's the International Criminal Court, I believe it's in Rome. There are international criminal tribunals for Rwanda war crimes, for Yugoslavian war crimes. Those are in The Hague. But the idea behind setting up the IHT was to have it be in Iraq, an entirely Iraqi venture. So there were one or two defense attorneys that these defendants had hired who were from outside of Iraq, but everybody else involved in the proceedings was Iraqi. And so our role in assisting and advising the Iraqis ended at the courtroom door, right? As those, I would help the prosecutors get ready, I'd help them organize their exhibits, I'd help them structure their trial, but I never went in the courtroom because that was entirely them. But once they got in there, everything that happened in the courtroom was broadcast all across Iraq so that every citizen of Iraq could watch Saddam's regime being held accountable in a court. And they could see the rule of law in place and they could see it working. And I think that had a huge impact on that country. Because everyone was so skeptical that I think a lot of people didn't believe Saddam was actually dead, but they were very skeptical of him ultimately being, or his people ultimately being held accountable. And so a premise of that system was that the entire country could watch the rule of law as it got applied to these people. But the fear throughout that country that he continued to perpetuate even after he was dead, it was palpable. You could feel it. It was still a very violent place at the time. I showed up there in March of 2007, lived and worked in the Green Zone. I left in September of 2007. The Green Zone is about a 4 square mile area inside Baghdad. Today, there's a big, beautiful, new-ish United States embassy there. At the time, the embassy was in one of Saddam's converted palaces. So it was a really fascinating place to go to work every day because I had an office in the embassy. Our office had sort of a wing in the embassy. To call it a wing is way too much. It makes it sound like much better than it was. It was actually sort of tucked under a staircase in kind of a corner of the embassy. The thing that made it a really great place to be was during the first 90 days I was there, we had 88 rocket and mortar attacks on the Green Zone. The second day that I was there, 2 U.S. contractors were killed by a mortar attack as they walked into the chow hall there right outside the embassy. So it was a very violent place. All of our the offices were all inside the embassy, but we all slept in what we called hooches. They were trailers, metal trailers if you've seen one or been in one, you know what it's like, right? The inside is very much like a cell. It's about 8 feet by 10 feet. Um, I was lucky because I was what's called an O6 equivalent, which is the equivalent to a colonel. Um, at that rank, if you will, I got my own hooch. But all of the enlisted and most of the junior officers had to share that 8 by 10 metal trailer with another person. They were set up in an H-shaped pattern and with a hooch on each side, and then in between was a small bathroom with a really small sink, a toilet, and a shower. And the water supply for the shower was actually up on the roof of the hooch in this round sort of globe kind of thing. And even with the hot water all the way off and the cold water all the way up, every shower I took there was hotter than any shower I would ever take back at home. It was pretty awful. So no shortage of hot water. That's the good news. But we had around the embassy, there were about 6 of those. We called them trailer parks because that's what they were. I mean, it was an assembly of these hooches. And I was lucky because I lived in the trailer park that was closest to the gym, but furthest from the chow hall. So that was good for a guy trying to not get fat in my mid-40s. But the second day I was there, some contractors were walking actually from the trailer park that I lived in over to the chow hall and got hit in a mortar attack and killed. So it was not a great place to be those first 90 days. But the great thing about that office that we had is when the sirens would go off and we'd have to run for cover, we were under this huge stone staircase. So we really didn't have to go anywhere except get back behind the stairs, and we were very, very safe in there. So that was really good news. The story about my wife was, so when you'd have a rocket or mortar attack, oftentimes, so there was a siren, a warning siren that would go off. So when the military would detect a mortar launch or a rocket launch, they'd activate the siren. And when you heard the siren, you'd run to what they call a duck and cover bunker. And it's basically Jersey barriers that are stacked with a concrete roof on the top and then an entrance that you would curve around on each end so that if there was indirect fire, you were safe from the shrapnel in there. You weren't safe in your hooch because the shrapnel or the rounds would go right through the thin metal walls of that hooch. But we got the siren, and oftentimes you wouldn't hear the siren before you'd hear actually the mortar rounds start to land, or you'd hear the rocket whiz over. And then 10 seconds later, you'd hear the siren. And you're like, oh, okay, thanks for the warning. Appreciate that. But we had the siren go off one night about 2 in the morning. And so, you know, I got up and hustled into the duck and cover bunker. And I was in there, and one of the good things about being over there is we each had a cell phone. And that's how we communicated with each other, but we could also call back to the States. And there was no restriction. So, I mean, I could call home whenever I wanted. I could talk to my wife. I could talk to the kids. They could call me. And so I'm in this duck and cover bunker at about 2 a.m. And this is a pretty long attack. I mean, there's round after round after round going off. And all of a sudden, my phone rings. And the United States is 6 hours behind, or we in Kansas, we're 6 hours behind the time in Iraq. So it's 2 a.m.-ish in Iraq. And my phone rings, and it's my wife. And I said, hello. And she just launched right in and said, your son just vomited all over the living room. And there's vomit everywhere. And it's in the couch. And she told me this long story. I never even had a chance to get a word in edgewise. I said, well, you know, call your friend Katie. Katie has a cleaner. And she was just as stressed as could be. And when we got everything straightened out, she had made arrangements to call Katie and have her friend come over. I hung up, and she never knew that I was in a duck and cover bunker and we were under a rocket attack at the time, until she came with me to a speaking engagement after I got back. I spoke to a legal group, and I told that story. And when I went back and sat down, she punched me in the arm. She was so mad at me, but it was just and I'm sure every service member goes through this, you try to mix what you're doing with what's happening back at home that you're missing out on and that you're not there to help with. And as a dad, that makes a big hole in your heart. But it it was a really interesting time to be there because we were a very small part in helping that country recover from generations of dictatorial rule. And we were there to help them implement not just democracy, but the rule of law, and to show them the right way to hold people accountable for horrible war crimes and just horrific atrocities that that regime committed. But it was really interesting to be a part of that process because, I mean, you probably remember seeing back in the United States the photo. I remember an iconic photo of an Iraqi woman with an ink-stained thumb, and she had shown up to vote and proved her identity through her thumbprint, right, and then was able to cast a vote. But the really interesting thing about that to me is, you know, we look at that from our perspective about how democracy is a good thing, right? And it is in our view, a God-given right, and it's something that everybody everywhere in the world should want and should strive for. But we wrestled every day with implementing that in a society that, in my view, wasn't ready for it, because they were so used to being told what to do. They didn't understand, really, they didn't grasp having the ability to do what you want or what you think is right. We could give them the right and the ability to vote, but so many of them, their response to that was, well, I need to ask the leader of the tribe who to vote for, right? Because that's what they were used to, their tribal allegiance. And at times, I've described American politics and where we've gotten lately, the point that we've gotten to in this country, as being tribal. And that's, to me, that's sort of where that comes from, is everything that every Iraqi did was in allegiance to their tribe. And they wouldn't do anything without being told by the sheikh that that's what they were supposed to do. And sometimes I feel like that is the point that we've reached politically in the United States. And when I say that sometimes I think politics has become tribal, to me, that's kind of what that means. But this is a photo that really sort of, to me, kind of demonstrates why we were there. I don't know if you can really appreciate it from the photo, but that's a man cage. That's a metal device that a person fits inside. And that one's on display now in a museum, but I think it went on display in 2008. But in 2007, it was in a Connex at a FOB, a forward operating base, FOB Kadamia, I think, in northeastern Baghdad. That's a device that Uday Hussein, Saddam's son, used to torture people. He would put people in that man cage and then just lay them out in the Iraqi sun, basically to roast alive. That's how Saddam and his family treated their political enemies. And if you've never been to Iraq, you know, people ask me, what's it like? What's the heat like there? And it's hard to describe. And it's so hot. I tell people it's like, you know, when you have brownies in the oven and you go to check on them and you open the door and you feel that wave of heat sort of slap you in the face. That's what it feels like, but trust me, it doesn't smell like brownies. So, but that's what the heat feels like. So I can't imagine, you know, having the morals that would allow you to put a person in a device like that and just leave them out in the sun to roast because they were one of your political opponents. But that's very much how Saddam and that regime worked. And so that was, to me, sort of an important reminder of why we were there and why the work that we were doing was so important. That was at a FOB, a forward operating base in the northeastern part of Baghdad. That's the FOB where the gallows were located. The gallows where Saddam was hung were located at that FOB. But we also had an evidence processing facility there at that FOB. So as we would help the Iraqis get ready for trial, we didn't do it very often, but we would take trips up to that evidence processing facility to make sure that we had gathered all of the evidence that we were going to need, for a particular court proceeding, for a particular event. And at the time, Baghdad was violent enough that we tried to avoid convoys, just because that was back during the time that Route Irish in particular. So Route Irish was the route between the Baghdad airport and the Green Zone. And Route Irish at the time, they were, it turns out it was actually Iran was behind a lot of it, but they were placing shaped charges along Route Irish and using them to attack the military convoys. So most of the time, even if we were going a fairly short distance, we'd do it by air. And so I was one of the agents who was assigned to me, a guy named Joe Nyland, was a DEA agent who was assigned to the FBI in Baghdad, and he was the case agent on our case. So Joe and I took a trip up to the FOB to go through some evidence, and we rode on a Black Hawk helicopter to get up there. And it was a pretty quick trip. It's only about a 2-minute ride from the Green Zone, but they dropped us off, and we spent the day going through evidence. And then by the time we were done with the evidence, we had a chance to go look at some of the things that had been seized and were being saved to display later, like this man cage. We went and looked at the gallows. And then when we were ready to come back, we called the command center and we said, hey, we're ready to go back to the Green Zone. Would you send a helicopter for us, please? And they said, we're sorry, everybody is tied up in an operation. We don't have anybody to send you. Well, do you have an idea when we might be able to get back? Maybe sometime tomorrow afternoon. So we'd taken a day trip. We weren't prepared to spend the night or anything like that. So we went back inside and started to get comfortable. And about 45 minutes later, the command center called and said, hey, it's 2 of you, right? And we said, yeah. And they said, do you have any cargo? And we said, well, 1 file box. And they said, well, go out to the LZ. We'll send 2 little birds for you. And so I don't know, Mike, I know has seen a little bird. A little bird is a little tiny McDonnell Douglas helicopter. It seats 4 people. There's a pilot and a co-pilot. But in Iraq, what they had was pilot, co-pilot, door gunner, and room for 1 person in the back. There were no seats in the back. The seat was actually a sandbag. And if you guys could pull up the video, Joe shot some video of our trip from the FOB back to the Green Zone. And it's a little choppy, but I think it's kind of fun to watch. So you can see Joe sitting there. So when you get in the helicopter, you just sit on the edge on the sandbag, and the door gunner reaches back and attaches a hook to your belt. So that you don't fall out. And we're lifting off here from the LZ. Joe put that on. So you can see me with my feet hanging out the side of that little bird. The door gunner's right behind me, and then there's a pilot and a co-pilot up front. And we took off. And again, these are Joe's boots, but we were low enough over the city as we flew back. I felt like if I could just stick my foot out a little bit further, I could probably kick the goat on the roof of that house right down there. But they were always very worried about rocket fire, even gunfire at those levels. And so we flew back literally, I mean, you can see how close we were to the treetops, and the two helicopters are, you don't really get much of a sense of it, but they're like this the entire time, just to, make sure nobody has a chance to take a shot at you. But it was sort of like the e-ticket ride at Disney World on that helicopter, I'll tell you what. One of the most thrilling things I'd ever done. I can't imagine what if I was somebody nervous about flying, I can't imagine what that would have been like. The first day we got into so the trip into Baghdad was really interesting. I flew commercial into Amman, Jordan, and spent the night at a hotel in Jordan, and was told to report out to the military airport the next morning. So I went out there to the military airport and then proceeded to wait all day long. And finally a C-130 showed up, and there were, I don't know, probably 50 of us or so that were on our way into the country. And so we all loaded into this C-130, and one of the things I learned about C-130s is you want to be in the first third or the last third that gets on that airplane, because the middle third, you go into seats where you're on a canvas seat that's along the side of the aircraft, and in the middle where the landing gear are, the people across from you are also lined up on a canvas seat, and you're facing each other, and you're so close to each other, your knees are interlocked like this. And I happened to be going into the country with a good friend of mine from Department of Justice. He worked at Maine Justice. He was a former Air Force intel guy and then an FBI agent, and then became a federal prosecutor. And he was the most squared away guy that I've ever met. This guy ironed, like his khaki pants that we wore, the cargo pants that we wore, his were ironed. Mine looked like I slept in them, but Steve's were ironed. And he had on a dress shirt, and then he had on a vest, like a cargo vest. And he was just one of those people that was always immaculately put together. And when you go into Baghdad, am I doing okay on time? They keep you up really high until you're right over the airport. And so as we crossed into Iraq, they turned out all the lights inside the airplane, so it's completely dark. And then when you're directly over the airport, you start this spiral, and you come down very steeply in a spiral all the way down to land. And they do that to protect from a surface-to-air missile. But I'm a pilot, and that made me kind of uncomfortable. That felt like it was a death spiral that we're in, spiraling down to the airport. You can't see anything. And it was kind of funny because Steve and I are sitting next to each other, and our knees are interlocked with this woman who's right across from us, and she's starting to get sick. And as we continue down, she starts going, and I grab a barf bag and try to hand it to her, and she can't even take it. So I open it up for her, and I put it in her hands. And Steve, Mr. Immaculate, who's right next to me, is watching her go. And I thought he was going to crawl out of his skin. It was one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life. But we land safely in Baghdad, and then they put us in a Black Hawk to take us from the airport to the green zone. It's my first time in a Black Hawk. I'd been in other military helicopters, but I'd never been in a Black Hawk. And they load us into the Black Hawk, and we take off, and it's only about a 2-minute ride in that helicopter. And right after, I mean, not 45 seconds after we take off, you hear this shrieking siren, and the aircraft banks over on its side, and you can see the flares shooting out the back. And I thought, I've been here less than an hour, and I'm going to die. And almost immediately, the pilot rights the ship, and I'm sitting next to the crew chief, and I said, I didn't say it cleanly, but I said, what was that? And he said, oh, the frequency for cell phones is very close to the frequency for surface-to-air missiles. So oftentimes we get an erroneous indication that a missile is headed towards us, and actually it's just somebody on the ground making a call on their cell phone. And my comment was something to the effect of, you could have warned a guy. You could have warned a guy about something like that, but it didn't happen. So I'm probably at my time limit. I'm happy to take questions if anybody has them. What questions can I answer for you?
Does the committee have any questions? Any questions? Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the stories and the briefing. I had a little bit different experience. Of course, I had retired from the military. When did you get over there? 2007?
2007, sir.
14 years before you got there. But I can recall going into Tehran, Iran. It was probably much like what you encountered over in your area. I can still remember going down the street, 6-lane boulevard, 3 going one way, 3 going the other way. They were hauling us into our crew quarters. And I can still remember the glass and steel high-rise office building that was going up. And right next to it is Joe the Camel Dealer. You know, it was just a contrast. It's unbelievable. We did get a chance to walk around very warily, but a bottle of Heinz ketchup was more expensive than a bottle of Scotch whiskey. So it was just amazing. It was just a contrast in how rapidly things were changing. And I can just imagine the feeling of witnesses behind that curtain. It must have taken a lot of guts to be a witness when they were so, I'll just say, afraid of what might happen if Saddam's regime ever did come back, because their lives wouldn't have been worth anything.
Part of my job, one of the things I did for the trial was I helped figure out how are we going to get all of the witnesses from the Basra province up to Baghdad, get them into court, have them testify, and then get them back to Basra safely. Because there still were there were forces that were very sympathetic to Saddam that these folks were afraid of. So they were scared to death of coming up. And you know, we tried plans where we would take U.S. military teams to locate them, round them up, transport them. And what we realized fairly quickly was it was going to be a lot easier if we used native Iraqis, you know, a lot less conspicuous. We had a lot better chance of getting them up and then getting them home without getting them killed. But it was a very complex plan, and it was fascinating because there was one point where the only 3 people in the country who knew what the plan was for transporting these witnesses was me, because I had come up with the plan, the chief judge of the Iraqi High Tribunal, which basically is like the John Roberts of Iraq, and our interpreter. And we were the only 3 that knew about that plan. I'm sorry. But the first morning of trial, we get all of them up to Baghdad and we house them in what we called an SVU, a secure victim unit or secure witness and housing unit. And that was so close hold that the location of that was not known to many of the people even in our office. And so the morning the trial started, I was assigned to bring round the defense attorneys up and bring them into court. So we had our protective equipment on, the helmet and the gear, and I got on what's called the Rhino, which was an armed bus. And we went to the hotel that was right at the edge of the green zone where all the defense attorneys were staying. And so as I was going into, they were supposed to assemble in the lobby. And as I was walking in to meet them, I heard a mortar round. And it was loud enough that I thought it was a round landing nearby. And so I was walking into the building, so I just lowered my head and continued on. I ran into the building. But once I got in there and we realized what was happening was what I'd heard was a launch of a mortar round that had come from just across the fence line, which was only it was less than 50 yards away. But I was so close to the launch that it sounded like a round. But that round had gone into the victim housing unit and it hit a trailer. And fortunately for everybody involved, the witness who was staying in that trailer had left the trailer and gone into the common area to have a cigarette. And the round landed in his trailer and blew it up and destroyed it. So he's the only person I've ever met whose life was actually saved by a cigarette. But that threw chaos into all, I mean, the witnesses, it was chaos, and we couldn't get them to get on the bus to come to court for the first day of trial. So by about 10 o'clock or so, we had convinced Judge Mohammed that we needed to have him go out to the victim housing unit and talk to the victims and calm them down. And that was the only way we were going to do it. So we geared up Judge Mohammed, and we put him in a Humvee, and we sent him out to the victim housing unit. And he was able to get all of the victims and witnesses calmed down enough that they were willing to come to court and testify. And then we get back to court, and Judge Mohammed's ready to start the proceedings, and he told the soldiers to go ahead and get all 12 of the defendants who were down in a detention, a holding cell down in the basement. And then we put them all in an elevator and started the elevator up to the 3rd floor to the courtroom, and the machinery at the bottom of the elevator caught fire. And so they were stuck. There's smoke pouring out of the elevator. All of our defendants are trapped inside the elevator with about a half a dozen soldiers who were guarding them. They ended up getting out safely, but all of that happened before 11 o'clock on our first day of trial. So it was a pretty unique experience to be over there. Pretty unique experience.
If I may, Mr.
Any other questions? Yes.
Just a real quick comment. I would really encourage you to tell your story to Oral History Project. You know, there are some experiences that we as Americans just do not understand. We've never come in contact with it. And the further and further we get away from the events that happened over there, the less it's remembered.
That's a great point.
Representative Butler.
Director, thank you for the memories that you're sharing. And I was actually going to just comment the same thing that Representative Goddard said. You know, so often we have the stories, the memories that are there, and you can tell how impactful it was upon your life, just as you were discussing the court proceedings. To be able to share those and be able to use those in memoirs and the things that are out there, because I agree, as we get older, things start disappearing. You know, my father-in-law was one example from Vietnam. He always wanted to write it down. He never wrote it down, and now he's gone. But we lose those things. You know, we need that history in our lives, and especially I think kids need that. Soldiers need that. I'd like to invite you to Junction City sometime to come out and talk to some of our veterans. So I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. It's the thing that I think makes this so relevant to what you do every day is that we have a system here that one of the oldest cultures in the world could only dream of having. And some days we get caught up, I think, a lot of days we get caught up in the politics of this, and we forget how important it is to have the rule of law in a society, and how lucky we are to have the society that we have. Because I can tell you there were a lot of people over there spending a lot of time, a lot of resources, and a lot of lives lost trying to give that to another society. And I don't think we should ever forget that.
Any other questions? I think the one thing I would say is I agree with all of that, and that brought back a lot of memories that seeing this and hearing what you were talking about, and we were in those areas. And the word that came to mind as you were talking about the story and it's perspective. And that's what you were just now talking about. It gives us a different perspective. That's why I wanted you to come in and talk with us, is because, you know, we need different perspectives on things. The danger of only one perspective is we take for granted. There's a danger of taking what we have for granted, our judicial system or our freedom or whatever it is. So we really thank you for what you did, and thank you for, and no, people go, no, no, but thank you. And it took a lot to do that. And that's what I want people here is there are sacrifices made all over. And my wife, we always called it being paid for having fun. She didn't like that because it was not a happy time for family when people were overseas.
If you'll let me, I'll finish with a quick story about my son. So
yes,
I love bragging on my kids, and I'm very, very proud of all of my kids. My oldest is a nurse, stem cell transplant coordinator nurse at Vanderbilt Medical Center in Nashville. My youngest is about to graduate from K-State. But my son, who's 25, is in the Navy, and he's been a corpsman for the last 7 years, and he's training to be a diver. He will be what's called a diver med tech when he graduates. But when he left at 18, he was a knucklehead, and he was ready to go, and we were ready for him to go. It worked out really well that way, and he's now a very, very squared away young man, and the military was the best thing that ever happened to him. But he came home from corpsman school, and he was 18 years old and still very much a knucklehead. And he came home for a few days in between assignments, and one day while he was home, he came to me and he said, "Dad, I don't know what to do when people thank me for my service. I don't know how to respond to that." And I said, "Well, how does it make you feel?" And he said, "I don't know why they're thanking me. It's a privilege to get to do this." And I think that's exactly right. Now, my thought at the time was, who are you and what did you do with Matthew Mativi? Because I didn't expect those words to come out of the mouth of an 18-year-old knucklehead, but in reality, I think they're very, very wise words.
Mouths of babes.
Yeah, exactly.
Where'd he go to dive school?
So he just finished at Great Lakes. He did the first 7 weeks. He called it institutional hazing. They started with 51 and they got down to 26. And now he's ready to go to Panama City Beach, where he'll do 5 months of open water training at PCB.
In both those places. Panama City's a pretty nice place for duty.
Looking forward to visiting them there. And then he has, when he's done with dive school, he has 3-year orders to Pearl Harbor. He will be the diver med tech for Naval Special Warfare Group 8 as soon as he graduates from school. So
Standing assignment.
I think
Congratulations. Has he been through pool harassment yet?
he has. He had some great stories about what he called pool hits. Yeah.
Representative Steele.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are you able to share how the court case turned out that you helped with them? I would just love kind of the end of the story.
Yeah.
Thank you for your service, truly. Thank you.
So the end of the story is that all of the defendants but 2 were convicted. The 2 that weren't convicted, we tried really hard to talk the Iraqis out of prosecuting those 2 because basically they were line level officers in the military. They weren't command level. And I think what happened with them was what happened with a lot of those folks is that by the time Saddam's regime was toppled, they were in positions of power. And so there's no doubt they deserve to be held accountable for the things that they were doing at the end of the regime. But during the Basra uprising, they weren't in positions of authority, and we didn't have them committing any actual acts themselves, right? So we tried to talk the Iraqis out of prosecuting those 2, and their response was, well, everybody knows they're guilty. Everybody knows they've done something that they need to be held accountable for. They were not, they were acquitted. The rest were convicted. Chemical Ali was convicted, sentenced to death, and later executed.
Any other questions? Sir, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
The invitation. Nice to talk with you folks.
Does anybody else have anything for the committee? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Boy, that's going to be a hard act to follow. I just want to make sure that the committee and our veterans and military who are watching online are aware that House Bill 2102 is going to be heard in House Education today regarding advanced enrollment of military students. And I want to extend my thanks to Representative Chauncey for introducing that bill. And I just want to also talk a little bit about the history of helping our Kansas military in the state of Kansas. In 2008, Kansas was the first state to adopt the Interstate Compact on Education Opportunity for military children in 2008. And I just have to brag on Representative Carlin, who brought that bill and got that signed and took it all the way across so that we could be the first state in the nation to sign that compact. So that hearing will be at 1:30 in 218 North. Okay, 218 North. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Meeting adjourned.